It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk pro wrestling, just what everybody wanted to talk about. We're going to talk about the history of pro wrestling, which you say is the most corrupt sport in history. But is it really more corrupt than boxing? Really?
Well, I don't want to give the show away, but yes, we are going to talk about why I personally think pro wrestling is the most corrupt sport in history.
So why are we talking about this, and what exactly are we going to be talking about that reinforces your idea that pro wrestling is indeed the most corrupt entity? Because I don't know if we should call it a sport. Sports entertainment.
Well, we will call it a sport, and then at some point we will change from calling it a sport. But there's multiple reasons I think it's worth talking, considering that I never talk about pro wrestling that much because I do not watch modern pro wrestling. But if you've read my stuff on Bloody Elbow and I guess on Cage Side Seats too, I used to do a lot of MMA history and a lot of pro wrestling history stuff. And when I mean history, I mean like 100 years ago history, not the modern stuff. So this is kind of right up my alley. And the reasons I want to talk about it is one is because I think the history of of wrestling, I should say, is an interesting counterfactual to boxing. As you see the different points of what changed in the sport, it's a parallel universe. What could have happened to boxing if certain things had happened? That's one I find interesting. The other thing is I think it's interesting is how much influence pro wrestling has on MMA. And I'm sure a lot of fans are aware of it, but we are going to get some details. I think they might not be aware of how the business of MMA functions today the way it does because of pro wrestling and only because of pro wrestling. And finally, we're going to talk about why pro wrestling was so much more corrupt and why that happened. And for that, I break it down into 4 eras to make it easier to follow. So as we go through today, first part era, I call the fixed era. The second era, I call the work era. The third era, I call the kayfabe era. And then the modern era is the sports entertainment era. We'll go through the first 3, and then I'm going to save the 4th episode for one where we specifically discuss the WWE. But people like this. I guess we could do an episode about each era. But if they don't like it, then you get this one. And that's it. God damn it.
What happened to the Attitude Era?
I don't even know what the hell that is. What are you talking about, the Attitude Era? We are talking about my era as a pro wrestling. I made these divisions so we could talk about the concepts and stuff that happened to them, not about some promotional gimmick that they did.
But the Attitude Era was the best era. That's when we had all the best shit talkers. We had Razor Ramon, Kevin Nash, The Rock. I mean, the whole NWO. That thing was all.
You're speaking Chinese to me. I don't have a clue what you're talking about. None of this matters. The show is off to a terrible start now
because John doesn't know his wrestling.
I don't. I know my wrestling from 100 years ago. I know who Jack Carkeek is. I know who Tom Jenkins is. I know Earl Caddick. People out there know them. They're my people. If they don't, well, too bad.
All right, so let's get to it then. What exactly was the fixed period, and why do you call it that?
Oh, at some point, if you go far enough in the past, wrestling had to be real because it's wrestling. It's just a sport where people actually wrestle. And at some point, it had to become professional. I don't know when that happened. When did people start doing it for actual money? We don't know exact date. We can find old documents and stuff that people would show up at fairs and for bets and stuff. We don't know exactly. But at some point it happened. And then at some point it stopped where they stopped doing it for real. And for during this period, I call the fixed period is where it began. I don't know when, but I have it ending around World War I. And during this period, which I don't have a clear delineation for because, things change over time. It's not an immediate, but I use about World War I as the rough estimate. Things were fixed, I call it, because wrestling was presented for the most part as a real activity, and the money was made for a large part on bets. And so because it was on bets, they were fixing the bets to guarantee their win. And people, for the most part, thought it was legitimate because they assume when wrestlers were competing for what was called side bets back then, which was, the wrestler had to put up money and then they would win extra money from the other side, that had to make it more legitimate. But after a while, they found a way to get around this because that's what good con men do. And so you have a lot of reporting back then about how the matches in the papers, they would call them frauds or fixed or hippodromes, which is another word for it back then. But that's it. The fixed period was the time when they presented it as real sport. And in many parts, it may have been, may not have been. But the purpose of it was to fix the matches to guarantee you would win on betting. And that's why I call it the fixed era.
Were there any legitimate matches during this time, or were they all fixed?
Well, this is where it gets hard to prove a negative. There are some people that assume everything was real back then. Only a few were fixed, and others that think they all were fake. It was very much like pro wrestling today. I wrote a paper on this I haven't posted ever called Was Professional Wrestling Ever Real? I will at some point have to put that out. But I am under the assumption I've compiled some evidence in that, and I under the impression that almost all the matches were fixed at the professional level. Now, that doesn't mean some matches were legitimate. Several matches seem very legitimate. And there's, obviously there had to be some legitimacy in some way because a lot of these guys were very talented wrestlers. Almost all the wrestlers taking part of this part had legitimate skill, could prove it somehow. And the nature of the matches would make you assume that some of them were legitimate. But for the most part, I think the majority were fixed. But again, that's what makes it different than like today's spectacle, sports entertainment or fraudulent matches or whatever you want to call them, is they could very well have been real matches back then. And the whole point was to make sure the audience didn't know if it was fake or not. And unlike boxing, which was harder to fix, so that's why boxing had less of this, in MMA, they could fix these matches, and the people in it were legitimate wrestlers and could very well have legitimately wrestled, but they had found a way that they could make more money on the fixing it.
How does this compare to boxing and other sports, and the time and how it was more corrupt?
Well, that's the interesting thing about this era. Every sport was accused of being fixed or fraudulent. Everything from boat racing to foot racing to bike racing to just every possible sport. Baseball had massive fraud after fraud after fraud for fixed games back then. So sports in general, because they weren't professionals or who were the people that were professionals weren't making a lot of money, gambling was the way to make money. And so fixed matches became epidemic throughout the entire sporting world back there in the United States. And so that's where we got a lot of fixed matches. Now, how does it compare to the other sports? Well, they all had problems when we talked about this, and boxing had a lot of problems. But pro wrestling, as I mentioned before, boxing had a lot of fixed matches, but pro wrestling was even easier to fix because boxing, you have to punch a guy, and the audience can kind of see if you hit him or not, or if you hurt him or not. Grappling, as we all know, it's very hard for a casual person to follow what's happening in grappling, especially, they didn't have cameras back then. There wasn't a zoom in to see what was going on. They were rolling on the ground. You didn't know exactly what was happening. It was easy to, pretend that a move worked, that you could get him down for a pin, that he couldn't fight his way out of a hold, that a torture hold, as in catch as catch can, they called them, or pain hold sometimes, would force a guy to submit. There was many ways to get around this back then when you were fixing it. So it was easier to fix wrestling. So wrestling was more corrupt in that way, had more fixed matches, more fixed than all the others. On top of that, the nature of wrestling, because the way it developed, and boxing had the same thing, but boxing again was slightly different because it's harder to fix, is wrestling started on as a, from different branches, basically a carnival sport in the late 19th century. And what that developed is the carnies were not on the up and up. They were constantly looking to fool suckers, and pro wrestling was the same. That's why we had the pro wrestling cant that came out, the carny talk that they used. And the slang that we use today kind of developed at that time, marks for the fans who don't understand what's going on. worked for real matches, or shoot for real matches worked for fake. All these slang that they came up with that was people never knew about for generations, developed then because they wanted to keep it secret that they're planning this. And you can see how fixed it was in some ways when you look at guys like Frank Gotch, one of the great champions. He was a tremendous local wrestler in Humboldt, Iowa. And the way he got into the professional ranks is a traveling furniture salesman came into town and was challenging the locals. And Frank Gotch gave him a tremendously hard match and beat him, which surprised it because the guy, this traveling salesman, was actually the American champion, Don McClade, who was traveling the country under disguise to con people to take their money in matches. And so they realized Frank Gotch is great, so let's bring him into the Farmer Burns camp at the time. Farmer Burns, people might know that name, a legendary catch-as-catch-can wrestler and champ. He brought Frank Gotch in. His first assignment, they gave him a fake name, Frank Kennedy, sent him up to the Yukon Territory to learn how to hustle people in fake matches, because he would play as being some yokel up there as prospecting. And then just whip them because he was just a tremendous wrestler. And so that was part of the scam. So they were building this way to make side revenue by cheating the audience. On top of that, they were doing fixed matches in the major events that had a lot of gambling, not just the side bets in the bars, but huge gambling by crowds and ticket sales as well. And gangs would develop. Wrestling gangs like the Marbury Gang is pretty famous with Jack Carkeek and Doc Roller. They would wander the country frauding people. Farmer Burns had a group of wrestlers when he was a champion around him, including Frank Gotch, that would work with him, and everybody was on the same page who would throw matches for who. And also that gang that surrounded him, Farmer Burns, protected him from other guys that wanted to be the champion or move up the ranks. And so they could have tough wrestlers put in place of their moneymakers to prevent other tough wrestlers from ever defeating them in legitimate matches. And so by putting this barrier around them, you could protect your champ. So why do I think it's more corrupt? One, there's just a lot more cheating and fixed fights going on in pro wrestling at the time. Two is they had a much bigger ecosystem of people working together to fix the matches. And so, if you look at it, it's one thing we look back at it as kind of this amusing carny days of pro wrestling. And so it's, no one thinks of it really as fixed because everybody now knows. But if you look back at the time and how many people they were defrauding and tricking and how elaborate they had set these up, they were so much more corrupt than what was going on in boxing.
You said you started that whole spiel with how basically all sports, they've figured out ways around stuff that, they basically cheat. And to your point, I watched a show recently, terrible show, but I ended up hooked on it anyways because I like period stuff. And it's called For Those About to Die. And it was set in Roman times, and it was set around chariot racing. And they used to actually weigh the chariots. And the way they got around having a light chariot was they would build a little shelf to hold bags of water, and they sealed it up so that when they weighed on point. They would kick up underneath the little shelf and would knock the water down, and then they have a light chariot again.
See, that is fascinating because it's true, because I did a lot of research into ancient Rome, and none of those matches fixed. Like gladiator stuff was very much like pro wrestling at times, because the gladiators would put on a show. They wouldn't really go at it. These were trained athletes, with air quotes there. Pancration in Greece, those guys were, getting paid and were pro athletes. And sometimes there's some question of fixed matches and stuff. So it goes back all the way to ancient times.
For sure.
This is not any time that there's money involved and an athletic contest, someone's going to try to fix it until you get to the point where the money you can earn legitimately so outweighs the fixed money that it can't compete.
And these days, it doesn't just have to be an athletic contest. They take odds for everything now. Everything. It is insane.
Yeah, we are back in some ways to this time of the, what I called the fixed era. We are back now because sports gambling has gotten so big. We're back then. The only revenue they really got, they sold tickets and they did other things, but and later, by the end of this period, you had Gotch and Hackenschmidt film their match and could sell the film, and so they made a ton of money. But for the most part, gambling was everything. And now we're back to that, where gambling is such a huge portion of the revenue that some of the athletes are making, especially in combat sports. UFC, I mean, I think, like I said before, their Apex events are basically based on gambling.
Yeah, for sure. What's the worked era, and how did we go from the fixed era to the worked era?
Well, as I made these titles, I took it from pro wrestling terms. And I use the word work because fixed, as I said, is the matches and some of the contests. You never know how many, but some of the contests were real matches or real contests. And the whole point was to fix it to win the bet, right? That was the point of that period. But what happened is, one is people started realizing matches were fixed. In 1915, they had this big legitimate wrestling tournament because, everybody was getting annoyed that they kept getting what they thought were fake matches. Legitimate or fixed matches, I'd say. They'd see the outcome and thought they're fraudulent. Most famously, again, Gotch and Hackenschmidt, although there's an argument that might have been real. The audience assumed it was, they claimed it was fake and they were fixed, and they were upset by it. And so in 1915, there was a tournament in New York that was supposed to, fix all legitimate wrestling. Tickets weren't selling that great. And then the masked Marvel shows up, the masked wrestler, a guy in a mask, defeats everybody. He's a huge sensation. Then they unmask him, and you realize he's Mort Henderson, and not a spectacular wrestler career-wise. And then it was revealed that the whole thing was, fraudulent matches. And that kind of killed the idea of, people were no longer betting on these matches. People stopped betting because they got burned so many times by what they assumed or knew were fixed matches. And then if you don't have fixed matches, the matches back then were long and boring. And that's a lot of part is because of the rules. If you watch, even the Olympics had just insanely long 10-hour Greco-Roman matches back then. People liked long matches. You think of the bare knuckle days with the Broughton rules and the London prize ring rules. They could go on for 100 rounds and go on for all day. Pro wrestling was the same. When people got to town to watch the event or went out when they set up a wrestling match, they didn't care that it took all day because they were there to enjoy it. That's the only entertainment they had. Later, you get to World War I, and entertainment opportunities start spreading. You got the train bringing people into town. You got movies have been introduced, radios coming along. So you had to compete with that, and you didn't have gambling anymore. And so what you start doing is you start introducing more entertaining matches. They're still fixed, but because you have no gambling, I call it the work period, because now you're working the match to entertain the audience, to get the ticket revenue and the other revenue streams, because gambling's gone. So there's my definition of the worked era, which starts in World War I, and I continue it. It's a very subtle change, but I continue it up until about World War II.
Okay. Why do you think wrestling was more corrupt than boxing during this period? Because, boxing had the mob famously starting to run it around then.
Well, again, part of it is because they worked so many matches, they were fake. But at this point, it's harder to get upset at them because they're not taking the bets, right? But the major reason, mostly because at this point we have trusts come in. Trusts are groups of cartels basically take over sport. We had that a little bit in boxing with the mob running boxing. But here, these guys completely controlled it. So we have these trusts coming in, like the Gold Trust Jail, and they would organize the wrestlers, they would organize the promoters. And so you had very little options outside of the trust to work. And the only ones that did that were that you have these rebel wrestlers that tried to do on their own and tried to do what they called shoots at the time and beat guys independently, but they quickly learned their lesson. They introduced guys like policemen, which were skilled wrestlers to protect other guys. Tiger Man Pesek is a famous example. So if you're a troublemaker and not following the path, he would come in and kick the crap out of you, teach you a lesson, and either send you away and not give you a job, or you would get in line. So there's a whole industry built on and keeping the wrestlers in line, and guys that ever wanted to, that were upset that they were more talented than someone else and expected to lose, they got the crap beat out of them or lost jobs. And so that was the way it worked. And so I in some ways, listen, I'm kind of pushing the envelope, being more corrupt. But again, if you want to consider pro wrestling a sport, and at this time, they still try to pretend they're a sport, right? Faking your matches, working your matches, I should say, because they played as real compared to actually have them in boxing, and having a trust in place, a group of people that control the sport and can completely lock you out, which happened a little bit in boxing, just not as well. That's a step above what boxing was knowing. So that's why I would call this as corrupt.
Question.
Yes.
These trusts, were they the precursor to promoters?
Well, they were promoters. The trusts are the precursor to the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, that appeared later. What they were was a group of promoters. The first was the Gold Dust Trio. Later, which was Gold Dust Trio famous, there's a book that came out about them called Fall Guys by Griffin, Marcus Griffin. And that was they put Ed the Strangler Lewis as the wrestler, Sandow as his manager, and Toots Mondt as the three. They kind of ran wrestling. Later, another group sprang up with Jack Curley, Paul Bowser, Toots Mondt again, and other guys, Ed White, I think. So,
is his name Toots?
Toots Mondt.
Like Toot Toot?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I'm sorry. I like the name. I had to stop there.
He's a famous wrestler back in the day. He probably exaggerates his claims because I think he fed a lot of the information to Marcus Griffin to make him a much bigger deal than he really was. But he was an important figure, and he is the figure in many ways responsible for the WWE, because he was partners with Vince McMahon when they broke away from the NWA, which will be coming up later in our story.
All right. So what were the wrestling governing bodies?
Well, this is where, again, we get another form of corruption coming in that you don't see in boxing, right? In boxing, we have sanctioning organizations. Now, we got to do a quick history of sanctioning organizations really quick. Originally, the champions in boxing and wrestling were just kind of like, everybody knew who he was, and then magazines started getting involved, like the Police Gazetteer and stuff, and said that's the champion. Then, because there was some people contested who was official, the athletic commissions got involved, and so the state athletic commission in 1920 basically took over for boxing. They had a rival in the National Boxing Association from 13 other states because they thought New York was dominating the sport. So they made an athletic commission. And eventually they moved in and took over wrestling as well, because there were so many questions over who was the real champ, and there was no legitimacy to the title. And so the NBA formed the NWA, the National Wrestling Association, which is a sanctioned organization. The New York State Athletic Commission sanctioned as well. So they were sanctioning wrestling events, right? Worked the matches, but the athletic commissions were a pain in the ass for the pro wrestlings because they mandated that they fight the top wrestler, and they would strip people of this championship if they didn't meet the top wrestler. Now, the problem for pro wrestling, when you fix it and you have a trust that runs it, some of the top wrestlers aren't in your trust, and you don't trust them to go along with the program. So you're terrified that your wrestler who might sell tickets, but might not be a tremendous wrestler, has to get in a ring with someone that can actually wrestle and might take the title away from him in a double cross shoot match. Right. And so Paul Bowser was a genius at the time. He did this first. He created out of thin air his own sanctioning organization, the AWA, not the later one, but the first. So he had his own title sanctioning organization, the AWA, and he could put it on his champion without worry that the state athletic commissions would enforce the rules on it. And so eventually these athletic commissions lasted, but eventually the pro wrestlers, the trusts and the promoters realized we can make our own titles and get away from the athletic commissions controlling the title. And then we can dictate who gets to be a challenger, and we don't have to worry about their rules. And as you can see, that is something boxing would never do and never did, which led to boxing being the way it is. And this would come back. The New York State Athletic Commission would promote titles for a while, but this idea of creating their own titles would come back shortly on the next era we get to. But for right now, that is, I think, again, it's an example of something that the promoters getting together to control the sanctioning organizations so they don't have to follow rules and give other people fair shots is something boxers, they dreamed about doing, but couldn't pull off.
Early stages of regulatory capture.
Yeah, very much. In this case, instead, they couldn't capture the regulatory, so they said, you know what, we're going to make our own regulatory body.
Yeah. So what's the next era? You mentioned it, so let's go ahead and get to it. What is the kayfabe era? Why do you delineate this one from the worked era?
Well, the difference here is it's very hard to figure out where it changes, but one major reason is in the 30s, there was a wrestler called Dick Shatak, and he was sued by one of the trusts because he wouldn't take a match. Basically, what they did is they were setting him up, and they booked him for a bunch of matches he couldn't take. He didn't even know about. He didn't show up, and when he didn't show up, they sued him to get to protect their championship because he had taken the champions from him, the title. Is a whole thing. But what happened during the lawsuit, it was revealed that all this stuff was worked. There were articles that came out, in the court, they acknowledged that it's all worked, basically ruined pro wrestling forever, because the idea that it was no longer a fake sport, right, was gone. Everything had been worked for the last, not every match. There had still been shoots. There's still been an occasional shoot where people were trying to take titles the last decade or so. But for the most part, everything was worked. And now the public knew it. And so I call this the kayfabe era because, yes, now the public, it was revealed that it was worked, but they never acknowledged it. And they kept trying to pretend at all times and treat it like a legitimate sport and that everything was real and this was all real. They wouldn't acknowledge it. Now, it was an era of all work compared to the worked era where there were occasional shoots. There was very little shooting going on here. But now the sport got a little more absurd. TV came in, stuff like that, got a little more absurd. But again, it's the kayfabe because they kept the kayfabe alive, even though there was kind of no reason for that because it was out of the bag, the secret.
Okay, so we've gone forward a couple of decades. So why is it still more corrupt than boxing at this current time?
I might be pushing it a little bit when I say this, but I think it's more corrupt. We look at two things. One is we talked about just a few minutes ago, we talked about the sanctioning organizations. Well, after World War II, the athletic commission still were doing some of the sanctioning. Wrestling promotions completely abandoned it and just made their own sanctioning organizations. The National Wrestling Alliance had their own. They shared the title amongst all the promoters. That was one. And then when the AWA split off, the American Wrestling Association of Minneapolis, when they split off from the NWA, they created their own sanctioning organization title. Same with the WWF, which became the WWE eventually. They created their own title. So they did something boxing never did. The promoters created their own title. And on top of that, at this time, in this era, this period, boxing was under antitrust investigation. There was a Senate hearings. There was a lawsuit filed by the United States government against them, the U.S. versus United States versus International Boxing Club of New York, going after investigating monopolies, antitrust violations, Sherman Act violations in boxing. Now, wrestling, too, had a couple investigations at this time from the FTC and from the government. But wrestling, unlike boxing, never had to deal with the consequences. And why is because while they share similarities with boxing, what they differ significantly in the eyes of those that are investigating is it was fixed. Wrestling was widely considered an exhibition, not a true athletic contest, as noted by boxing promoter Truman Gibson in the boxing hearings, monopoly hearings in the 60s. This difference in perception extended to gambling. They noted that they never heard of bookmaking on wrestling matches, unlike the rapid gambling associated with boxing. So as we talked about previously, because wrestling had become fixed, no one was gambling on it. And because of those two reasons, they decided not to look into it. On top of that, senators acknowledged that wrestling likely involved some degree of control from the top. So yes, it did have antitrust violations there, but it was found to be rife with fakery in their words. They also argued that wrestling faced similar issues to boxing in terms of talent development, but from scheduling matches, stuff like that. But the big thing was, despite these similarities, wrestling promoters also faced antitrust problems, ultimately entering into the consent decree and said they would just address it themselves. So they gave them a pass to let them do themselves. And so the number one reason, essentially, why wrestling and boxing shared some parallels at the time regarding talent management and potential monopolistic practice and stuff like that, the perception of wrestling as an exhibition rather than a genuine contest, coupled with the absence of significant gambling interests, set it apart in the minds of those that should have been investigating. So the fakery, as we said earlier, the fraudulent nature of wrestling, the way they fixed it and defrauded the audience, protected them later when the Senate and the government came around to investigate monopoly. And so they were given a pass to violate the Sherman Act from then on.
All right. I have a side question here before we get to our last one, because that just opened a can of worms for me.
Go ahead. That's what we're here for.
All right. Let's say that never happened. They never got the pass to violate the Sherman Act. If those allegations happened today, would they possibly be investigated?
Well, when we get to the next era, we might talk a little bit, but yes, the same problems now that they were talking about in MMA. Mm-hmm. In other words, the promoter owning their title doesn't apply to wrestling. Especially doesn't right now because they acknowledge it's fake. It's just acting, right? It's I mean, I hate to, because pro wrestling fans, we all acknowledge pro wrestling's hard to do. It takes athletic skill, but it's stage, it's theater, sure, right? Sure. And because of that, you can't hold, there's no restraint on trade by denying your title. The difference is now between back then is because it was the kayfabe area and they didn't acknowledge it was fake, that the fans still put value in the champion, just like they did in boxing. And so the champion had a monopoly over the title, basically. And that title drew much more money and gave much more prestige and renown to whoever held it. And so other wrestlers would want it because they didn't have their own. Now, what happened is the AWA and WWF at the time, when they spun away, they had to create their own type championships, their own titles. And unlike, again, as we talked about in a previous episode, it kind of demonstrates the problem pro wrestling promoters have. You can't just crown someone champion when people view someone else as the legitimate champion. You need to convince them that your guy's the champion. And so they went to elaborate lengths back then. The AWA did a whole thing about booking the challenger, the champion against their guy, Verne Gagne, and doing a whole thing where he ducked Verne, and then Verne is now, because he's the number one challenger, he gets to be crowned the champ. So they did this whole thing to make Verne look legitimate as the champion. With the WWF, they did the same thing. They had to go an elaborate length to get Bruno Sammartino the champion. What they did is they took the previous NWA champion, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, a name we seem to forget a lot on the show, but Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, they booked him to become their inaugural WWF champion. And that way, when Bruno Sammartino beat him, the audience, who are used to him being the NWA champion, recognized Bruno as a champion. So they had to go elaborate lengths to give their guys a rub. Nowadays, that doesn't matter because everybody knows, again, it's theater. But that's why at the time, an antitrust charge could probably have been brought forward, because it was a restraint on trade from the NWA to prevent other promoters and wrestlers from having access to that title. But today, again, when you have theater, it doesn't really matter.
All right. Final question for today. How does what happened to pro wrestling back then impact MMA today?
Well, that's a good question, because what I just talked about has a huge impact on what we're seeing today with the UFC and MMA. Because pro wrestling, unlike boxing, forget that it's fraudulent, because pro wrestling created their own titles, their own sanctioning organizations inside the promotion, so they have their own titles. That's how everybody assumes pro wrestling works. When MMA appeared as Pancrase and then UFC in the United States, the model they looked to wasn't boxing. The model they looked to was pro wrestling. Now, pro wrestling is fake, which is why they weren't engaging in antitrust violations at the time. But because pro wrestling appeared and had built this model, built on a model that was only allowed because they were a work sport, MMA adopted it. And now you have a professional sport, a legitimate sport with actual, contests that are operating not like boxing, that has the sanction organization separate from the promotion. They're operating like the work sport, pro wrestling. And so when people talk about MMA is just pro wrestling, in many ways, this is what they're talking about. It's a self-contained universe with the promoter. And so the promoter has the monopoly over their title because they own it. And in this case, the UFC has a monopoly over the sport because they own the one legitimate title. So you have the best of both worlds. You own a title like you do in pro wrestling, but like boxing, where people need to recognize who's the legitimate champion, you're the only one with the legitimate title. And so you have a monopoly over the sport because of that. So I think that's why the history of pro wrestling is so important in MMA, because it had such an impact on how on how pro wrestling functions today. The model we use for the business is based entirely on not boxing, even though we have sanctioning athletic commissions that oversee pro wrestling and do a lot like boxing. It's based on pro wrestling, the sister sport of boxing, that at some point decided they're going to make it fraudulent. And because of that, they were allowed to print up their own titles. And the government gave them a pass from antitrust scrutiny because of that.
For MMA and pro wrestling to now be bonded, what kind of can of worms can we expect, say, 10 years down the road, since, the biggest of the two organizations are now one?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen down the road, if it's going to lead to any problems, because they are operated slightly different. They share a lot. They do pay-per-views, TV, shoulder programming, all these things for crossover. But the core thing is that the UFC are hopefully remain legitimate contests inside the cage. There's some questions about the legitimacy of the rankings, legitimacy of who gets title shots, things like that. But in the cage, legitimate contests. And pro wrestling are going to be, theatrical spectacle. So I don't know what problems there, but the number one problem might be the fact that they just, as an entity, they have so much money, it's going to be very hard for anybody to compete with them. For
sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I should note, our next episode to talk about on this, we are going to look at the modern era, called the sports entertainment era. And that is basically the story of the WWE now, formerly WWF, and how they took over everything, and how just one of the worst companies in history.
And that'll be next Thursday. Today's episode is free, 100% free. You get the whole show for free because we love y'all. But next Thursday, it won't be free. So just want to put that out there right now. What I want you to do also right now is follow this guy on Twitter. He is at HeyNotTheFace. His messages are open. So if you have questions, comments, suggestions, send them his way. You might find your name mentioned here on the show. My messages are also open. I am Crooklyn MMA on Twitter. If you send me anything about this show, it will 100% find its way to John. On that fine note, we are going to wrap up. From here, y'all know the drill. Until next time, subscribe and please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!